But right now, I'll hand over to Anouchka to talk about how eco-anxiety isn't an illness, which I think is a fantastic start to the talk.
Hello, yeah, thank you everyone for having me, and to Kate's great introduction and show's amazing talk, and the last slide, which is genius. That should be everywhere. So I'm going to try not using up paper and printer ink by using my screen as a prompter. So if that's weird, it's the first time I've done it, please let me know in the chat. But so I started writing, actually don't let me know in the chat because I can't see it, so Kate, just tell me. So I started writing about eco-anxiety a few years ago, I think in 2019, after the Greenlandic Perspectives survey came out. And so I'm sure lots of you know, but it was a study of how climate change was affecting people in Greenland. And they'd chosen Greenland just because it's a country on the front line of climate change. And so the difficulties are obviously particular to each climate. So there, the melting ice makes it difficult for people to travel and see friends and family. And also it's causing the economic systems there to change much too fast for people to keep up. And also they're suffering from these sort of severe, unpredictable storms. So almost all climate change studies before that had focused on the impact on the environment and on wildlife. So, but this one was particular in that it focused on the mental health of human beings. And they found that 90% of Greenlanders felt that they were witnessing the effects of climate change at first hand. And the knock-on effects of that seem to be increased levels of depression, of anxiety, alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide. So it was shocking to read the survey. It's very upsetting. But I guess if you work in that field, it's not shocking. So in my work as a therapist over the last few years, people have been talking more and more about their anxieties around the climate crisis. And you can say, Kate was mentioning about the psychoanalytic contributions to the journal. You can talk about what people's sort of internal things that they might project onto the climate, but also you have to talk about how the climate impacts people's internal lives. So people would often be describing not being able to sleep because they're so haunted by images of ecological destruction, or maybe they just feel this kind of overall sense of hopelessness about the future. Or the thing that I just was hearing over and over again since maybe 2015 or before was people in their 20s and 30s saying that they felt they'd never be able to have children because of the terrible state of the world. So they'd be reading all the stuff like we've only got a decade to turn things around, or that there's only so many harvests left at the current rate of consumption, or that we're going to reach 1.5 degrees of warming within the decade, and that looks pretty certain, or any number of terrifying predictions. And it would just feel so apocalyptic, as if there's no hope for any kind of future, and it would be cruel and irresponsible to bring new people into this world. So what can you do in therapy when the problem's so big and so real? Because it's not like you can tell people to sort of calm down and get over it. So just to break it down a bit more, this term eco-anxiety, there seem to be a few different ways people experience it. And also just the term itself, lots of people in the climate psychology movement don't like it because it's a bit sort of pathologizing, like the idea of a sort of anxiety disorder. And especially, I suppose, the suggestion with anxiety that the thing you're afraid of might not be real. So there's a kind of preference for terms like climate grief. But the four ways it might register, loosely speaking, anxiety, grief, pre-traumatic stress, which is a funny term, and I'll talk about it in a minute, and also guilt and denial. So, with anxiety, there might be the fear of what's happening and this kind of sense of panic. But I suppose that the thing about anxiety that you might try to focus on in a treatment is that it can at least be energizing. Like, it's terrible if that energy turns against you and stops you from sleeping and functioning. But the feeling of powerlessness is so horrifying that one of the most helpful things it seems people can do is to turn the anxiety kind of outwards into activism or getting involved with other people who feel the same way. So these things called climate cafes where you can go and just speak, and people won't try and, I don't know, tell you not to be so silly. And because it can make you feel a bit sort of exacerbate your craziness if everyone's telling you that the thing you're afraid of isn't real. Or you can write blog posts or get involved in campaigns, and always this difference between the kind of big things like, you know, petitioning government, but also small things like going vegan or cycling to work or school or whatever. That it's not that you, I think environmentalists are often told that it's pointless to do recycling. You've just got to sort of change the entire insurance industry or something. But it seems that doing both is very helpful to people who experience anxiety. And also there's this second definition of anxiety, which is willingness to act. So, you know, you're anxious to do the right thing by your friend or whatever. So if you can kind of tip things over to that kind of active form of anxiety, then that seems to be one thing that might be alleviating. Then there's grief, which I guess can kind of do the opposite. It can sort of demotivate people. And I guess grief and depression, melancholia would all be in the same category. And the risk with those feelings is that they can generate kind of hopelessness, that, you know, everything's lost already and it's too late. And that kind of resignation is obviously a perfectly natural defense against psychic pain. So it's like it might seem safer to people to get on with mourning or with accepting the loss than with fighting against it, because if you fight, then the risk is that you're going to lose. So maybe sometimes people try to control the situation by sort of losing or giving up on purpose, or, you know, before. Then there's this slightly, I don't know, unusual new idea, which it's been christened pre-traumatic stress, and it's a kind of twist on the older idea of post-traumatic stress. You know, where something terrible happens to someone and they can't quite recover from it or process it, and the trauma keeps coming back. So in the case of pre-traumatic stress, the traumatic event hasn't happened yet, but the person can see it coming and feels absolutely helpless to do anything about it. And of course, you know, all sorts of bad things have already happened climate-wise, but I suppose we're talking here about this next set of possible consequences. So, you know, the collapse of supply chains, or social breakdown, or mass displacements of people, or even wars, these sort of mega catastrophes that people talk about, that are the consequences of the things we're starting to see now, potentially, of a kind of escalation. And so that term was invented by a psychiatrist called Lies van Susteren to describe the effects on climate scientists who were seeing the changes unfold in the environment, you know, whatever, the loss of species, or the melting of ice caps, or increased wildfires, soil erosion, you know, the stuff. But they felt unable to communicate what they were seeing to either to ordinary people or to governments or whoever. So either they might be worried that they were wrong, because, you know, their observations led to very serious predictions about the future, and they didn't want to risk, you know, freaking people out unnecessarily. But if they didn't tell people what they were seeing, then how would they stop it happening? And basically, I think what we've seen in the last few years is a kind of push through of that. And so scientists have really heroically been trying to tell people, but they are being confronted by these sort of terrible obstacles, like whatever it is, right-wing think tanks promoting bad science in order to protect the, you know, the oil industry or whatever. And it's like these sort of spectacular forms of mass gaslighting. And I think, yeah, gaslighting is a good term for it, because it involves the inappropriate use of fossil fuels. But it's horrifying to see, you know, that the scientists are seeing this stuff happen, and still that, you know, people are being paid to try and persuade the rest of us that it's not happening. So maybe counterintuitively, one of the most useful ideas for people experiencing pre-traumatic stress is a thing I first heard about from an Australian GP whose patients were often coming to her with worries about the climate. And she lives in a part of Australia where they experience really devastating wildfires. And she was using the term functional denial, which, yeah, denial doesn't have a good rap in the climate world, but it's like when you grasp the reality of climate change, it can be so horrifying, so sort of enormous, that it risks really interrupting your life. So in order to just keep going, you might need to function a kind of function, you might need to practice a kind of functional denial. So it doesn't mean you buy a sports car and eat loads of industrial beef. It just means you give yourself a break from worrying, you do whatever you can, whatever you enjoy, that makes it possible to switch off. So I know it kind of sounds banal, but I think it's serious, and everyone who works in the field says the same thing. So you have to kind of allow yourself to register the real terribleness of what's happening. If you push it out of your mind, it's going to come back in some form, if especially if you're studying it firsthand from day to day. But you somehow have to then find ways to live with that knowledge. And it seems that sort of thing is also very good for enabling all of us to make changes in our lives. Like once you've absorbed enough of the science, things like shifting across to a plant-based diet or getting a bike or not buying clothes on the high street is really easy. So yeah, it's a kind of, I don't know, perceptual shift. Then last of all, there's this pairing, I guess, of guilt and denial. So you could say it's one or the other, or that one leads to the other. But and you could also say it's not a bad thing if people feel guilty, as long as it makes them change what they do accordingly. But the problem seems to come very often when people try to block guilt out of their mind. So, and that enables them to keep taking unnecessary flights or promoting damaging business practices, or just, kind of standing by the idea that climate change isn't happening and that the rest of us are being silly. So in terms of, I don't know, who's got a pathological condition, that one seems, that's the kind of risky one. Yeah, it's like a Miss Havisham situation or something. It's like refusing to acknowledge reality. It isn't going to help that person actually get married, or it isn't going to help anybody, but it seems to be quite popular. And the weird thing is that some, psychotherapists, psychiatrists have that exact condition, and do have, tried to talk patients out of it. So it was great to have this edition of the British Journal of Psychiatry about climate change, and try to sort of alert everyone to the fact that climate psychology is really serious, really urgent, and everyone has to get on board with it, because you hear these terrible stories of people being told by their therapist or whatever, like, oh, don't worry about that, it's not going to affect us in the UK, or these things that are just so sort of inhumane and irresponsible. But yeah, I guess maybe it comes from some therapists think they have to make people feel better quickly, and that will be a way to make people feel better. But it seems, well, it doesn't seem to work very well. So what can you do as a practitioner in that field? It seems that the most important thing is to acknowledge that the climate emergency is real. And I guess a good analogy in terms of work might be something like therapies that help people deal with bereavement. So in those cases, you have to acknowledge that the bad thing is real. You'd never try to persuade someone that their loss isn't that bad or whatever. And anyone can sort of intuitively understand that in that field, that's what you have to do. So you have to acknowledge the loss and then see what's possible from there. And it's not easy, but at least it's sort of, helps people to adapt to the real. And I think there's also the problem, especially historically, and you read about it in some papers, that therapists are put off by the idea that if they take the climate crisis seriously, then some people, including maybe their patients and maybe relatives of their patients, might think that the therapist or the psychiatrist or whoever is mad or is irresponsible. So you're sort of supporting your patients' kind of irrational fears. But it seems that, I don't know, certainly since 2018, I hope, we are really beyond that stage, and any of the stragglers need to catch up. So there are all sorts of therapies that can help in a way be alleviating once you've acknowledged the reality, and that could be anything from talking therapies to yoga, or even SSRIs can help people through things. It's not going to change the climate, but it might help them be better activists even, who knows. But it seems the thing of sort of living with uncertainty that I think psychotherapy is good at having something to say about, and theorizing and putting into practice in the clinic. And there are all these great books about that stuff. There's a book called The Great Derangement, and How to Die in the Anthropocene is a great one, but it's how do you bear something unbearable? And it seems there are all sorts of things that people can develop, like the idea that you just have to be open and have a capacity for change, or knowing that you would help other people, that it's not going to be a kind of Mad Max style breakdown where everyone's just out for themselves. But I got totally depressed while I was writing the book about eco-anxiety, because I think when you engage with it, that you're going to get depressed. And it was sort of unbearable, but you do come out the other side and function again, kind of because you have to, you're here and you have to. And it seems preferable to go through that process and come out elsewhere than to try to hold it off. And so now, because of that book, I get asked quite a lot by, I don't know, people on podcasts or whatever, but how do you tell the difference between a healthy concern for the climate and eco-anxiety? And I think, I don't know, I would say that the difference is that people who experience eco-anxiety are actually better informed and more realistic. And that if you have this so-called kind of healthy concern for the environment, that's nice for you, but it probably leads to yet more business as usual. And actually a sense of emergency is a very good sign of even being better adapted, even though it's less comfortable. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anouchka. It reminds me from, there was a quote by Carolyn Hickman, actually, and she said, she was talking about moral injury, which gets talked about a lot in health services, but she kind of said that moral injury in the face of climate inaction is a sign of mental health, and that it means your conscience is alive. So I think that kind of echoes what you were saying.